The Italian Navy is generally not the first to come to mind for aircraft carriers. They have built some excellent small carriers in Garibaldi and Cavour. But that doesn't change the fact that Italy is far from the first choice for a carrier navy. This was especially true in the 1940s, where the Regia Marina lacked any aircraft carriers, or a proper naval air arm in general. There were attempts to fix this, of course. Today's video will look at the most famous attempt in the form of Aquila, a converted ocean liner and a ship with a lot of potential, especially for a first aircraft carrier. However, that potential was squandered by Italian industrial issues and changing priorities, and for that matter, the Italian armistice. Still, Aquila is worth looking at for what might have been. First, a bit of background. The Italian Navy considered some form of aircraft carrier for much of the interwar period. Almost immediately after the Great War, for example, there were plans to convert an incomplete battleship. That was the Francesco Carlacciolo, and those plans went nowhere, mostly because of the fragile Italian economy, which is why the ship was canceled as a battleship as well. The Italians simply lacked the resources. That would be a common theme when it came to carrier construction. Over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, various designs were put forward. Even after the Regia Aeronautica absorbed Italian naval aviation, those continued to crop up, ranging from hybrid cruisers, like the infamous flight deck cruisers in the United States, to more traditional ships. I could go on and on about these various design concepts, and perhaps I'll do a dedicated video in the future. But what these all share in common was a failure to launch. While various Italian officers and designers came up with designs, none of them were picked up. This is often attributed to the Regia Aeronautica blocking naval aviation. And in fairness, that was an issue. The real bottleneck, however, remained economic issues, with an additional lack of dock space. The Italian Navy entered the interwar period with battleships that were already a bit outdated. The cruiser force was, if anything, even worse off. So, with a fragile economic situation and limited dock space, the Regia Marina chose to focus on surface ships. The expected enemy was France, who only possessed the dubious Bayarn for their part. As such, the Italians concentrated on modernizing the surface fleet. While carrier concepts continued to be developed, the Italians simply didn't have the ability to build them. So the bottleneck was as much with the Navy as with the Air Force. It was a bottleneck that remained in place until the Italians went to war once again, and found themselves facing not the French, but the British Royal Navy. At first, it was assumed that Mussolini's off-sided, Italy is a natural aircraft carrier thing, would be enough. This would prove to be a tad optimistic in the face of British carrier aviation. The Regia Aeronautica did not collaborate well with the Regia Marina. Often planes showed up late or not at all. The Navy would, as such, generally sail without air support beyond their floatplanes. This was certainly an issue. It was not, however, what prompted a new look at aircraft carriers. That was the shock of the Taranto raid on November 11th, 1940. While the Italians had already contemplated the conversion of an ocean liner to an auxiliary carrier, this raid drove home the potential of aircraft carriers. Within a couple months, in early January 1941, Mussolini officially ordered the conversion of the liner Roma. This was a large, but admittedly slow ship, a perfectly good option for a conversion when you got down to it. So the Italians took plans from the mid-1930s, specifically 1936, and tried to modify them. This was done to try and speed things along and save resources with a simpler conversion plan. It is worth noting, though, that this still proceeded very slowly. Neither the Navy or the Air Force were particularly invested in the project. The Navy still had other priorities, and the Air Force was incredibly reluctant to give up any control over their aircraft. And in fairness, Italian industry had enough trouble just supplying the Air Force. However, into this stalled program came the second shock to the Italian system. the Battle of Cape Matapan in late March 1941. As if losing 3 heavy cruisers in one night wasn't bad enough, this came about because of British carrier aviation, specifically HMS Formidable. With this battle driving home the ability of carriers, the conversion kicked back into gear. Mussolini twisted the Air Force's arm, and the Navy saw the need for the ship. As such, Roma finally began her proper conversion into the aircraft carrier Aquila, with a more ambitious design that we'll look at now. First and foremost, obviously, came the gutting of Roma's internals. The old liner was torn down, with the superstructure and fancy fittings removed. This would be replaced by a hangar and full-length flight deck. The ship also had her hull lengthened, with a new and more elegant bow, replacing the straight stem of the ocean liner. A large island with the bridge and funnel integrated into it also took shape on the starboard side. This carried a single Gufo radar, making Aquila one of relatively few Italian ships to carry one. Next, there needed to be armor protection fitted to the hull. This consisted of 60 to 80 millimeters, 2.5 to 3 inches of armor, fitted over the magazines and aviation fuel tanks. However, the Italians also went a step further and completely swapped out the machinery. As a liner, Roma could manage around 20 knots. A carrier needed to be more like 30, so the old boilers and turbines were stripped out. Instead, Aquila would be powered by the boilers and turbines from 2 cancelled Capitani Romani class cruisers. Between the 2 power plants, this came out to 140,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. That was in normal operational condition. The power plant could produce 151,000 shaft horsepower if necessary. This was similar to the solution the Japanese came up with for powering Katsuragi with 2 destroyer power plants. This could push the carrier through the water at around 30 knots, as was hoped, which is impressive considering the hull was also fitted with new bulges. These were intended for, in order, torpedo protection, extra stability, and improved hull form. There was also, evidently, a layer of concrete behind the bulges for splinter protection. With all these changes, Aquila's displacement rose to around 23,500 to 24,000 tons at standard loading. Full loading, meanwhile, went as high as 28,000 tons. In theory, anyway. That displacement allowed for a decent air wing, all things being equal. While studies were made into folding wing aircraft, the air group was built around the RE-2001, which was, no matter the modifications, still a fundamentally land-based aircraft. It lacked folding wings, and while the landing gear was reinforced, it still wasn't designed for carrier operation. While likely capable enough, they would probably have had the same issues as sea hurricanes or sea fires in actual service. There's also some reference to Fiat G50s being tested as well. But, so far as I'm aware, this was more testing the aircraft than any serious attempt to use them. Although even this was more in the interests of a 2-seater recon aircraft. As could be expected without folding wings, the air group was limited. Even with a deck park and hanging aircraft from the hangar roof, this remained the case. Aquila was planned to operate between 38 to 51 aircraft. The latter number took advantage of the deck park and the hangar roof. If folding wings could be worked in, that rose to a hypothetical 66 aircraft. For an ocean liner conversion, and the first Italian carrier, that's plenty respectable. Although it would have been entirely fighters or fighter bombers from all indications, with the RE-2001s modified to carry bombs, or, in truly bizarre fashion, a single torpedo. In any event, let's round this off with defensive weaponry. The final planned layout consisted of 8 single 135mm, 5.3-inch guns. These were carried in pairs, mounted to sponsons just below the flight deck. To support the big guns, Aquila was also intended to carry 12 single 65mm guns in further sponson mounting, though these were still in the prototype stage at the time. What really makes Aquila stand out, though, was the light anti-aircraft battery. No fewer than 132 20mm guns, which is a positively Japanese number of light weaponry. These were put basically anywhere there was an empty space in 22 interesting sextuple mounts. With all of that said, however, we've reached the end of the design and background. This was quite a lot of material, and more than usual for my videos. Simply put, that's because Aquila would never be completed. I wanted to put more focus on the background and design as a result. In any case, construction slowed down in late 1942 as resources and manpower became scarce. Many Italian ships were damaged and required repairs, like Cavour or Bolzano. The battleship Impero was also being worked on off and on. And then there was a second, albeit less ambitious carrier conversion in Sparviero. All of this conspired to slow progress on Aquila. Her completion date drifted from late 1942 into summer 1943. This estimate was pushed even further back as other issues cropped up. For example, bombing raids on Genoa in November 1942 forced the carrier to relocate to the Ansaldo shipyards. The ultimate result of all of this was Aquila lagging behind. By June of 1943, the engines were successfully tested in port. This was good, and the ship was planned to do sea trials by September of the same year. And then the Italians switched gears entirely to light forces like escorts. This change in resource allocation also doomed Cavour to an incomplete repair, and Impero to never being completed. Work on the carrier did still continue, but only barely. Aquila would be left in place, with the hull and engines functionally complete. However, the fitting out was only about 70% complete, and almost none of the weaponry had been fitted. The catapults and arresting gear were similarly lacking. Not to mention, very few of the planned aircraft were even ready. The ship might have still been completed had it not been for the Italian armistice. That came in September 1943 and saw all the work grind to a halt. The Italian government in the north lacked the resources or motivation to work on the ship. The Germans didn't care and actually stripped everything useful off the hulk, just like they did to Impero. The stripped hulk would be subjected to various attempts to sink her after this point. The air raids on Genoa continued, but these did fairly minimal damage. And then, in 1945, the Italian co-belligerent navy decided they didn't want the Germans to block the harbor with the carrier's hulk. So they sent frogmen in to try and sink the ship themselves. This took place in April 1945 and did little damage in turn. The Germans might have tried to block the harbor after this, but if they did, they failed. In fact, by the end of the war, Aquila was found afloat and in decent enough condition. 2 years of neglect and various minor damage aside. The carrier had a bit of a starboard list, but was otherwise in good shape. With the ship back in Italian hands, Aquila's story came to an end. There was some consideration given to completing the carrier, but this didn't happen. Political considerations and the need to rebuild a devastated country and economy rendered this moot. Aquila would languish in port until 1952, before ultimately being scrapped. A shame, as she would have made a decently capable, and certainly beautiful, ship for post-war Italy. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.